The Answer.
Listen to AM 560 The Answer online at 560theanswer.com, on the AM 560 mobile app, on your Alexa-powered smart speaker, and on TuneIn, iHeart, and on Odyssey. Now, from the Signature Bank Studios, this is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson. Only the biggest stories, only the biggest guests, and only the biggest opinions. This is AM 560 The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Joel Kotkin over at Chapman University is a guy I reference semi-regularly. I think he's one of the best thinkers and content producers on what's happening in America. He wrote this book called Becoming Neo-Feudalism, which is must-reading. He and Michael Lind at University of Texas, I think, have their finger on the pulse of the divides in America. He's got a new piece over at unheard.com talking about what's happening as urban centers, not just in America, but also in Europe, depopulate. He writes that of a modest revival across the Western world in the countryside and rural hinterlands. Yet even as they begin to regain appeal, rural areas are struggling against the dominant urban drive to net zero, which threatens economies based on local fossil fuel development, farming, manufacturing. For instance, it was high energy prices brought on by climate policies that sparked the Yellow Jacket movement in France's small towns, villages, and ex-urban communities. To meet climate demands and limit their use of chemical fertilizers, Dutch farmers, among the world's most efficient and ecology-minded, have simply risen up and joined their Spanish, Polish, and Italian counterparts. Even worse, the urban elites propose reaching their net zero fantasies by physically disfiguring rural communities. And it's being pushed by the modern-day oligarchs in this country, like Jamie Dimon at J.P. Morgan, like Larry Fink at BlackRock. And so it had me thinking about what's happening now as opposed to the so-called Gilded Age, the robber barons age, as the left terms it. They're the progressive left, the radical left, the Jacobin left's mantra has been then and is now income inequality is driven by the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer at the hands of these oligarchs, but it's the rich getting richer, some of these oligarchs getting richer, by suppressing the creative energies of the poorer. And so I thought, per a piece that she co-authored with Phil Graham in the Wall Street Journal, a good time to have our friend Amity Shlaes back on to discuss. Amity is the board chair of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation, the winner of the Hayek Prize, and best-selling author of The Forgotten Man, A New History of the Great Depression, and Great Society, A New History, both also books you should pick up and read if you haven't. Amity, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Glad to be here.
So let's talk. Bert Folsom wrote a great book called The Myth of the Robber Barons 15 years or so ago, maybe more now. And it seems like you're sort of picking up where he left off, talking about what our past history in this country is. And I'd like to contrast it with the current circumstances. So start with the history of the Gilded Age and what people misunderstand thanks to the Howard Zinns of the world and the other leftist forces that attempt to rewrite American history.
Well, you said it just right. There was the presumption because big men were getting rich and maybe had monopolies or the appearance of monopolies, everyone else was losing. That was the impression 1870 to 1900. And it was sort of novelized, set in the culture by various books. You know, the phrase comes from a Mark Twain book. Upton Sinclair then picked that up in the New Century, wrote a book called The Money Changers, and other books we know. But the reality was in that period, and the data are clear, is that poorer people largely saw improvements in their lives. That is, the price of food went down. That's very important for low earners. Wages, by and large, strengthened, especially for trained people. And the essential, the big falsehood is that poor people were locked out. They weren't locked out. There's a wonderful study of millionaires, and millionaires became millionaires all the time, even people who started out poor. there's a wonderful study by a guy named Hugh Rockoff of that. Life expectancy generally went up, illiteracy went down, textiles went down, fuel costs went down. So it's hard to, you can find snapshots of hideous situations. Think of Tenements by Jacob Riis or so on. But overall, things got better in America, even for poor people, and there was no zero sum. And when you move that to today, of course, the argument is monopolies are hurting poor people, or poorer people are locked out, and it's a zero-sum game. That's what the economist Paul Krugman says, for example. It just largely isn't true. There are problems in society, but it's not that some people get rich.
So compare and contrast the captains of industry from that bygone era to the captains of industry today. Some of those I mentioned, like your Jamie Dimons and your Larry Finks, who leverage government and, in some cases, world government institutions to impose their policy goals.
Well, Dan, you're getting at two things. One is, and so did Mark Twain. I really liked the Gilded Age book. Rich people who use government are wrong. That's the crony state. They shouldn't be able to leverage government, derive rents from that. That is true. Rich people who make money with a company do far less damage. And actually, the case against monopoly now is much weaker than it was at the turn of the century. Why? Because in those days, people were fighting over land or commodities in the ground. And it's very possible to circle an oil well with guns and claim it for yours and shut everyone else, and there's no more oil in that town. Well, the kind of wealth we have now, which is, say, a formula, an algorithm, is much more ephemeral. There are way fewer barriers to entry. Google comes along and surpasses, in many ways, Microsoft. Great antitrust case in that time against Microsoft bundling with a browser, right? So the barriers to entry into surpassing other companies are just smaller than they used to be, and therefore less in need of government action through antitrust. Is that clear? Does that make sense?
Well, it does, but then how do you view what's happening now and its connection to the divide, the hollowing out of urban centers where you've got the very wealthy and the poor and middle-income families that both parties like to speak to? They haven't gone away. They've just moved away from urban centers to the suburbs, the exurbs, even rural communities. But yet, because we went through this period where urban centers attracted so many people, they have reach beyond their corporate boundaries. And so, you don't live in Chicago, you sort of live in Chicago land. And what the cities have done a good job of doing is sort of socializing the costs of their policies outside of the city proper.
Well, I like Kotkin, but this is way too complex. People love to live in cities. All people, rich people and poor people. They don't like hour-and-a-half commutes. They don't like to live in a fortress or a gated community. Why do they do that? Because we don't address social problems in cities. Mm-hmm. There's nothing more heavenly than living in certain areas of Chicago, in certain quiet neighborhoods, if there weren't terrible crime, if the schools were adequate. We don't have to say great. We have to say adequate. So that's a problem the cities aren't taking seriously, or seem somehow unable to address, and Chicago isn't the only city. In fact, I'm always stunned at how much crime people are willing to tolerate to live downtown.
Was crime fueled by progressivism? I mean, you wrote that everything that is old is new again, so what fueled the rise of it?
So you want to go, hi, Amy, you want to go back to it, and that's what I'm just writing a book about that, which is why I had the honor to write with Phil Graham. I seized that honor. In progressivism, I think wealth. When you're a wealthy person, you start to have you say, I better have a conscience now, as if you didn't before, and you say, well, things ought to be even better than they are, and I feel a little guilty.
Yep, that's
so
what
I'm going to start figuring how to redistribute it. Prosperity causes progressivism. So there you are. Really good writers get ideas, Upton Sinclair, and they paint pictures. And what is quite interesting about the Gilded Age is it just didn't, the fiction version didn't go along with the truth, and people knew it. Even Mark Twain knew it. I find this, he coined the phrase, right? He wrote a book, his first novel, Gilded Age, but Mark Twain had a best friend who was a robber baron. That robber baron worked at Standard Oil, exactly who the government wanted to break up in 1907, 1908, like then. Mark Twain defended the robber baron, whose name was Rogers, and worked in Standard Oil. Why? Because the robber baron had been his financial advisor and had saved Mark Twain's rear end when Mark Twain almost went bankrupt through bad investment and money management. So and if you actually go back to the Gilded Age, to Dan and Amy's point, it's not about rich people are bad. It's about rich people who work hand in glove in a military-industrial complex with the government their bed. Well, yeah, the government, a lot of the Gilded Age book is about government corruption, handing out special deals to certain investors. Well, yeah, that's wrong. We shouldn't do that. That's the problem. It's more the cronyism, or we would call it, security complex. You can have a lot of names. Various contracts, various concessions that specific companies get. Yeah, that's wrong. But it's not the market that's wrong.
Well, right. So the same rent-seeking behavior that you see now, you saw previously. But so I wonder how you would compare or contrast. Maybe there's symmetry there between the Rogerses and the Carnegies and the Rockefellers to the top of the food chain these days, and hedge funds and banks and so forth, big tech.
I think we wouldn't have been having this conversation before 2008. Our original stand in the modern period is certain banks were rescued in 2008, certain banks weren't. And we all remember that. And that's a long time ago for younger people, some of whom were born after 2008. But in 2008, it was very much pick and choose by the administration. Oh, well, maybe not Lehman, let them go. And maybe, yes, this other bank. And by the way, maybe this bank profited from the rescue that we chose to do here in Washington. Well, we have to do it to save the Western world. That it was a very corrupt or corrupted rescue, the whole 2008 story. Certain automakers, why should the government pick and choose who wins in a financial crisis? So once you have the government doing that, yeah, you don't like capitalism because it isn't capitalism anymore. So the scare in 2008 was so big, we were all told the world was going to go down unless the Treasury and the government and Congress voted. But, there are banks in the world that did not take the rescue to TARP. They exist. And maybe the crisis wasn't quite the way we depicted it. So I think once we did that, we wrecked wrecked our own confidence in markets, because markets aided by government are not the same thing as markets.
Yeah, interesting to point to that as an inflection. You write in your piece with former Senator Graham, at its root, progressivism is based on a myth and fueled by envy, the same caustic force that has destroyed prosperity and endangered freedom from the time of the ancient Greeks. What's the big myth of progressivism?
The myth is that you can make it better by redistributing. The best way to make things better is to give people opportunities to get their own money. That's the simple thing. So it's redistribution versus opportunity. And people think, well, the world is shut to me, and then I have no chance. They've shut the door in front of me. They went into the heaven of wealth, and I am not permitted. That's what that's what the vision was in the books, and there were certain snapshots where it appeared that way for a while. And Theodore Roosevelt himself, Twain couldn't stand Theodore Roosevelt. It's a hilarious rivalry between the two big egos. That's part of it. But Twain said, look, Theodore Roosevelt is hurting the economy, really. He saw that in addition to opposing TR's imperialism, the Philippines, the whole situation in Cuba. Twain didn't like that. he said Theodore Roosevelt is I don't have a quote in front of me, but basically TR thought it was fun to pick bad companies and torture them. Theodore Roosevelt, in his way, was the original populist. And if you go back and read the interactions between TR and the big companies, J.P. Morgan went to see Theodore Roosevelt and said, so now you're going after these companies. You're going to go after my other companies. And TR said, I'm paraphrasing, only if we think you have done something wrong. Well, that's reassuring. TR didn't say, only if you have broken a law that's statute. He didn't say that. He said, only if we think you have done something wrong. Well, that discretion is very creepy. That's autocratic. Government shouldn't have the discretion to decide this company is bad. There should be a set of rules we all play by, just as in a sport. So that was the problem with TR. And what my new book will do is look at the panic of 1907, that period. I think the government caused it through too much aggressive action against companies, and then it begged its very targets to rescue the markets when they crashed, and they did.
We'll look forward to your new. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
But, does that help you?
Yeah, it does. That's a wonderful explanation, as always. You elucidate things very nicely and neatly. We'll look forward to your next book. She is Amity Shlaes, board chair of the Calvin College Presidential Foundation, winner of the Hayek Prize, best-selling author of the books The Forgotten Man, A New History of the Great Depression, as well as Great Society, A New History. Amity, thanks as always. Appreciate it.
Oh, thanks to you guys.
Thank you. And she joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Listen to podcasts of Dan and Amy from the AM 560 mobile app. Download it today at 560theanswer.com/mobile.
Hey traders, listen up. With inflation, interest rates, and the recent banking crisis, are you nervous about what's coming next in the stock market? If you're ready to take control of your trading and predict trends instead of reacting to them, then Vantage Point is for you. Did you know Vantage Point predicted the trends of all the collapsing banks weeks in advance? Vantage Point's artificial intelligence technology analyzes massive amounts of market data in seconds, so you can predict future trends with up to 87.4% proven accuracy. Instead of using lagging indicators to make bad decisions, with Vantage Point, you can forecast market trends days ahead for better trade selection. Learn how when you text DEMO to 813813 for a free live class. Are you ready to take control? Text the word DEMO to 813813 and learn more today.
Trading involves financial risk and is not suitable for all investors. By texting, you agree to the terms available at VantagePointSoftware.com and consent to receive calls and texts using automated technology about offers or info by or on behalf of Vantage Point. Your consent is not a condition to purchase and can be revoked at any time. Message and data rates may apply.
Text DEMO to 813813.
All right, it's time for our annual AM 560 golf outing, sponsored by Signature Bank. And this year, we're partnering with an incredible organization, the Tunnel to Towers Foundation. These great people help to provide for our first responders,